Visual Studio includes a new code generation engine and scaffolding for ASP.NET MVC and the Web API. It's a bit like a mini project dialog because when I say add new scaffolded item, I get a dialog with a tree of categories on the left and items that appear on the right where I can select what I want to generate. And this is a little bit different than just saying add new item and finding an MVC controller. First, because adding a new scaffolded item can often require some additional information. For instance, if I try to scaffold out an MVC5 controller with views using the entity framework, it needs to know about a model class and a data context class. And once I click add, there's an entire scaffolding engine that will go through and reflect upon those classes, reflect upon the model, and then generate code that uses my classes and is specific to that model and data context class. Secondly, scaffolding can add multiple items to a project. So when I do scaffold out this controller, I can create not only the controller file, but also all of the associated views, whereas add new item only adds a single item. I could also do something like create an area for my application by coming into the scaffold dialog and selecting a new MVC5 area. This one also needs some input, but it's a little bit simpler. It just needs a simple name for the area. And it can add the areas folder. If it's not present, add my new area that has its own controllers, models, and views, and even include the default routing for this particular area of the application. And if you haven't worked with areas before, they're a technique you can use for larger applications and keep a set of controllers and views inside of a different folder in the project. And now a couple questions come to mind. One is, can I add new scaffolding? And the answer is that this is currently a difficult process, something I hope will become much easier in future updates to Visual Studio 2013. And secondly, if I cannot add new scaffolding, can I at least customize the existing scaffolding? And the answer to that question is yes. And it's not too difficult, although the process could be made much easier. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to customize the code that is emitted when I say add new scaffolded item, and I select a controller with read-write actions. I'll just let it be called default1 controller. Imagine I have a base controller in my project, and every time I run this scaffolding, I would prefer this to create a controller that is derived from my base controller instead of the built-in MVC controller. If that's the case, what I could do is come into my project and add a new folder called Code Templates. And the idea here is that when I place templates into this folder that have a specific name that Visual Studio expects, it can use my templates instead of the built-in templates. And I can customize those templates to emit the code that I want. The best way to do this is to copy in the existing templates and just tweak them. To find the existing templates, I need to go to the Visual Studio installation directory, which is typically Program Files or Program Files x86, and then Microsoft Visual Studio 12. From here, I go to Common 7, IDE, Extensions, and at this point, we're about halfway there, so hang on. Now I go to Microsoft, Web, MVC, Scaffolding, Templates. So again, that full path is under Microsoft Visual Studio. It's Common 7, IDE, Extensions, Microsoft Web, MVC, Scaffolding, Templates. It's inside of here where I will find folders with the default templates. And I could take all of these folders and copy them into my Code Templates directory, and then I could tweak any of the templates that are used to generate code from any of the items in the scaffolding dialog. Or I can pick just the one that I want to customize, like MVC controller with actions. You'll have to do a bit of guessing just based on the name, but the names are generally pretty clear. This one will match to the scaffolding item that I selected that generates that controller. I'll take that folder, paste it into my Code Templates folder, and now Visual Studio will use what's inside of this folder instead of the defaults over there in the Program Files folder. And if I open this up, I can see it consists of T4 files. If you haven't worked with T4 files before, and there's one here for C# and one here for Visual Basic, since this is a C# solution, I could stick with just the C# one. If you haven't worked with these templates before, they're very similar to Razor views because they can contain literal text, like this namespace is a literal, and then it can contain code expressions, which in Razor would be preceded by an @ sign, but in T4 templates, it's less than pound. And less than pound equals is essentially a way to do a response.write. So there's a variable somewhere named namespace I'm going to emit that here. Namespace is one of the inputs to this template. Visual Studio will figure out what the namespace is supposed to be and pass that in. And when this template executes, it will combine the literal text and these little pieces of C# code to generate the code for a controller or a Razor view or anything. With Razor, we take some literal text and C# expressions to generate HTML. The Razor syntax is much prettier, obviously. T4, you can control what you're going to generate just by changing the output extension. And now if I always want to use base controller, I just need to change this literal text to say that we're going to use a base class of base controller. I'll save that template. And now let me try the scaffolding again. So add a new scaffolded item, an MVC controller with read-write actions. We'll call it default2 controller. And now default2 controller was created with that base controller in place already. I don't have to modify the CS file. And that's just by copying in the proper scaffolding template into my project and putting it under code templates.